The old pickup truck wheezed to a stop outside Murphy's bar, its engine making the same tired sound it had been making for the past 10 years. Behind the steering wheel sat Walter Johnson, an 84-year-old man whose weathered hands told stories of decades spent working hard and living honest. His dark skin bore the lines of 8 decades of life, and his gray hair was cut short and neat, just like it had been since his army days back in Korea. Walter turned off the engine and sat for a moment, looking at the familiar neon beer signs glowing in the bar's windows. This wasn't just any Tuesday evening for him. It was the same routine he'd followed every week for the past 15 years, ever since his beloved wife Rose had passed away. Back then the house had felt too quiet, too empty. Rose used to fill every corner with her laughter, her cooking smells, and her gentle humming while she worked in the garden. Without her, the silence was deafening. That's when Walter discovered Murphy's Bar. It wasn't fancy, and it wasn't loud like those sports bars downtown. It was just a simple neighborhood place where working folks came to unwind after a long day. The owner, Murphy himself, was a decent man who served honest drinks and didn't water them down. The food was simple but good, and most importantly, nobody bothered you if you wanted to sit quietly with your thoughts. Walter climbed out of his truck, moving slowly but steadily. His left knee always gave him trouble when the weather was changing. A reminder of that cold morning in Korea when shrapnel from a Chinese mortar had torn through his leg. He'd been just 19 then, scared and far from home, but he'd done his duty. The Purple Heart in his bedroom drawer didn't make the knee hurt any less, but it reminded him that he'd earned every ache and pain honestly. He pushed open the heavy wooden door of Murphy's Bar, and the familiar smell of beer and fried food welcomed him like an old friend. The jukebox in the corner was playing something soft and old, the kind of music that didn't assault your ears. A few regulars sat at the bar, nursing their drinks and watching the baseball game on the television mounted. High in the corner, Walter nodded to Murphy, who was wiping down glasses behind the bar. Murphy raised his hand in greeting, already reaching for the tap to pour Walter's usual beer. They'd done this dance so many times that words weren't necessary. Walter made his way to his corner table, the one that gave him a clear view of the door and the television but kept him out of the main flow of traffic. The corner table had become his sanctuary. From there, he could watch the world go by without being part of the noise and chaos. He could remember Rose, think about their 52 years of marriage, and sometimes even smile at the memories of their 2 children who now lived far away, with families of their own. They called every Sunday dutiful children who loved their father, but they had their own lives to live. Murphy brought over Walter's beer and set it down gently. "How you doing tonight, Walter?" "Can't complain," Walter replied, which was his standard answer. He could complain, of course. His arthritis was acting up, his Social Security check barely covered his medications, and the house needed repairs he couldn't afford. But complaining never fixed anything, and Murphy had enough troubles of his own without listening to an old man's problems. "The usual for dinner?" Murphy asked. Walter nodded. "A burger, cooked medium, with fries that weren't too greasy. Simple food for a simple man." He'd eaten fancy meals in his younger days when Rose would cook elaborate Sunday dinners for the whole family. But those days were long gone, and Murphy's burger suited him just fine. As Murphy headed back to the kitchen, Walter took a slow sip of his beer and let his eyes wander around the familiar space. The walls were covered with old photographs of the town's history, faded pictures of long-dead politicians and local sports teams. There was even a corner dedicated to military veterans, with photos and memorabilia from various wars. Walter's own service photo hung there somewhere, though he never looked for it. He didn't need reminders of his time in uniform. The bar was quieter than usual tonight. Old Pete, who usually held court at the far end of the bar with his stories about his construction days, wasn't there. Neither was Linda, the waitress from the diner down the street who sometimes stopped by after her shift. It was just Walter, a couple of guys at the bar, and the peaceful atmosphere he'd come to depend on. He pulled out his phone, an old flip phone that his grandson had insisted he carry for emergencies. The boy meant well, always worrying about his grandfather living alone. Walter smiled thinking about the young man, so different from the scared kid who used to hide behind Rose's skirts when he was little. Now he was all grown up, serving his country just like his grandfather had done. All those years ago, Walter was about to put the phone away when it buzzed with a text message. His grandson always texted around this time, checking in like clockwork. Having dinner at Murphy's, Walter typed back slowly, pecking at the tiny keys with fingers that weren't made for modern technology. All good here. Murphy brought the burger, and Walter ate slowly, savoring each bite. He wasn't in a hurry to get anywhere. Time moved differently when you were 84. Days could feel like forever, but years seemed to flash by in the blink of an He'd learned to appreciate the small moments, the simple pleasures that made life worth living. The peace of the evening was about to be shattered, though Walter didn't know it yet. Outside, the rumble of motorcycle engines was growing louder. Heading straight for Murphy's Bar, the riders weren't from around here, and they weren't the kind of people who appreciated quiet corners and gentle old men who just wanted to eat. The dinner in peace, Walter finished half his burger and pushed the plate away. His appetite wasn't what it used to be, and he'd learned not to waste food. Murphy would wrap up the leftovers for him to take home, where they'd become tomorrow's lunch. It was a simple system that worked for both of them. As he sat back in his chair, Walter felt the familiar contentment that came with routine. This was his time, his place, his small slice of peace in a world that often seemed too loud and too fast for an old man. He had no way of knowing that, in just a few minutes, his quiet evening would explode into something that would change everything. Not just for him, but for everyone in that small bar. The sound of motorcycles grew louder outside, but Walter barely noticed. He was lost in his thoughts, remembering a time when he and Rose used to dance to the song now playing on the jukebox. Those were the good days, when the future stretched out ahead of them like an open road, full of possibilities and dreams. Now, the road behind him was much longer than the one ahead, but that was okay. He'd lived a good life, served his country, loved his family, and tried to be decent to everyone he met. That decency was about to be tested in ways Walter never could have imagined. The rumble of motorcycle engines outside Murphy's Bar grew so loud that the windows started to shake. Walter looked up from his half-finished burger, his weathered brow furrowing slightly. In all his 15 years of coming to this place, he'd never heard such a racket. The sound was deep and threatening, like thunder that wouldn't stop rolling. Murphy paused in his glass cleaning, glancing toward the front door with a look of concern. The two men at the bar stopped their quiet conversation and turned toward the windows. Everyone could feel it. Something was about to change the peaceful atmosphere they all cherished. The engines cut off one by one, leaving an eerie silence that felt heavier than the noise had been. Then came the voices, loud, rough, and filled with the kind of aggressive energy that made decent people want to look the other way. Heavy boots stomped across the gravel parking lot, and the sound of crude laughter drifted through the walls. Walter had heard that kind of laughter before, during his time in the service. It was the sound men made when they were trying to prove something to each other, when they were looking for trouble and didn't much care who got hurt in the process. He'd seen it in barracks and bars overseas and in the kind of places where young soldiers went to blow off steam. But he was 84 now, and he'd hoped those days were behind him. The front door burst open with enough force to make everyone jump. 6 men in leather jackets and heavy boots filled the doorway, their presence immediately changing the entire feel of the room. They were big men, the kind who worked with their hands and settled arguments with their fists. Their jackets were covered in patches and symbols that Walter didn't recognize, but their attitude was universal. They owned whatever space they entered, the biggest one. A man with arms covered in tattoos and a beard that hadn't seen a razor in months looked around the bar like he was surveying his new kingdom. His eyes swept past Walter dismissively, focusing instead on Murphy behind the bar. "We need drinks," the big man announced, not asked. "Lots of them, and we need them now." Murphy nodded nervously, his hands already reaching for glasses. These weren't the kind of customers he was used to dealing with. His regular patrons were working folks, retirees, people who said please and thank you and cleaned up after themselves. These men looked like they'd never said please in their lives. The group spread out through the small bar, claiming tables and chairs without asking if anyone minded. Their voices filled the space that had been so peaceful just moments before. They talked about bikes and roads and places they'd been, but underneath it all was an undercurrent of aggression, like water rushing toward a dam that was about to break. Walter tried to focus on his food, but it was impossible to ignore the change in atmosphere. The two men at the bar had gone completely quiet, staring into their drinks like they were hoping to become invisible. Even the jukebox seemed to be playing softer, as if the music itself was trying to hide. One of the bikers, a thin man with greasy hair and missing teeth, noticed Walter sitting alone in his corner. "Hey, look at that," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "We got ourselves a genuine old-timer over there." Walter kept his eyes on his plate, hoping they'd lose interest and move on to something else. He'd learned long ago that the best way to deal with troublemakers was to avoid giving them what they wanted, attention, but the thin man wasn't ready to let it go. "I'm talking to you, Pops," he called out. "Don't you know it's rude to ignore people when they're trying to be friendly?" The big man with the tattoos laughed, a sound like gravel in a cement mixer. "Leave the old man alone, Tommy. Can't you see he's trying to enjoy his dinner? Probably took him all day to save up for that burger." The group erupted in laughter at what they thought was the height of wit. Walter felt his face burn with embarrassment, but he kept his composure. He'd faced worse than this in Korea, when enemy soldiers were shooting at him. A few loud-mouthed bullies weren't going to break him now. Walter finished what he could of his meal and signaled to Murphy for the check. The sooner he could leave, the better. He had no interest in whatever these men were planning, and his presence seemed to be encouraging their bad behavior. As he waited for Murphy to bring the check, Walter's phone buzzed with another text from his grandson. The young man was checking in again, probably wondering why Walter hadn't responded to his earlier message. Walter smiled slightly as he read the words. "Hope you're having a good evening, Grandpa. Love you." He was trying to figure out how to respond when nature called. The small restroom was at the back of the bar, past the tables where the bikers had set up camp. Walter hesitated, but there was no avoiding it. He pushed back his chair and stood up slowly, reaching for his walking cane. The cane was something he'd only started using in the past 2 years, after a fall in his kitchen had left him with a twisted ankle that never quite healed right. He didn't like needing it, but pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. Getting around safely was more important than looking strong. As Walter made his way across the bar, using his cane for support, he could feel the eyes of the bikers following him. They'd stopped their loud conversation and were watching him like cats watching a mouse. The thin one, called Tommy, was grinning in a way that made Walter's stomach clench with worry. Walter was almost past their tables when it happened. Tommy stuck out his heavy boot right into Walter's path, but did it casually like it was an accident. Walter's cane caught on the boot, and suddenly he was falling forward. His hands reaching out desperately to break his fall, he managed to catch himself against the wall, his heart pounding from the shock and exertion. Pain shot through his bad knee as he struggled to stay upright. His cane clattered to the floor, rolling away toward the jukebox. The table full of bikers erupted in laughter. Tommy slapped his knee like he'd just seen the funniest thing in the world. "Oops," he said, not sounding sorry at all. "Guess I should watch where I put my feet." Walter turned around slowly, his dignity intact despite the fall. He looked Tommy straight in the eye, his voice steady despite the anger building in his chest. "Why would you do that, son?" "I never did anything to you." The question seemed to surprise Tommy, like he wasn't used to his victims talking back. For a moment, the laughter died down, and there was something almost human in the young man's eyes. But then the big man with tattoos spoke up. "You calling my friend a liar, old man?" Tommy said it was an accident. Walter felt the situation escalating beyond his control. He'd been in enough fights to know when words were about to turn into something worse. "I'm not calling anybody anything," he said quietly. "I just want to get my cane and go about my business." But the big man was already standing up, his massive frame blocking out the light from the bar. "Maybe you didn't hear me right," I said. My friend didn't do nothing on purpose. You got a problem with that? Before Walter could answer, the man placed both hands on Walter's chest and shoved him backward with enough force to send the elderly veteran stumbling across the floor. Walter's legs, weakened by age and the shock of the first fall, couldn't support him. He went down hard, his shoulder hitting the wooden floor with a sound that made everyone in the bar wince. The room went dead, silent except for the sound of Walter's labored breathing as he tried to process what had just happened. In all his 84 years, through war and peace, through good times and bad, no one had ever put their hands on him in anger, not like this. Not when he was defenseless and just trying to live his life in peace. Murphy stood frozen behind the bar, his face pale with shock. The two regular customers stared into their drinks, afraid to look up. And Walter lay on the floor, not because he couldn't get up, but because he was trying to understand how the world had become a place where young men thought it was acceptable to push around their elders. Walter slowly pulled himself up from the floor. His pride hurt more than his body. Every joint ached as he struggled to stand, but he refused to show weakness in front of these bullies. His shoulder throbbed where it had hit the wooden floor, and his bad knee was screaming in protest. But Walter had been through worse. Much worse. The bikers were still laughing, slapping each other on the back like they'd just witnessed the greatest comedy show on earth. The big man with tattoos was grinning so wide that his gold tooth caught the light from the neon beer signs. "Watch where you're going next time, Grandpa," he called out, causing another round of laughter from his friends. Walter bent down carefully to retrieve his walking cane, moving like a man who knew his limitations but refused to be defeated by them. The wooden handle was scratched from where it had hit the floor, but it was still solid. Like him, it had seen better days but was far from broken. He made his way back to his corner table without another word, his head held high despite the humiliation burning in his chest. The bikers continued their crude jokes and loud talk, but Walter tuned them out. He'd learned long ago that some people weren't worth the energy it took to stay angry at them. Murphy approached Walter's table cautiously, his face flushed with shame. "Walter, I'm so sorry," he whispered, glancing nervously toward the bikers. "Are you hurt? Do you need me to call someone?" Walter shook his head slowly. "I'm fine, Murphy. Don't make trouble for yourself over this." He could see the fear in the bar owner's eyes, and he understood. Murphy had a business to run, employees to think about. Getting crossways with a group like this could mean broken windows, damaged property, or worse, but Murphy wasn't satisfied with that answer. He'd known Walter for 15 years, had watched him come in week after week, always polite, always respectful, always tipping well even when money was tight. This man had served his country with honor, had raised good children, had buried a wife he loved with all his heart. He deserved better than this. "Let me at least get you some ice for that shoulder," Murphy insisted, but Walter waved him off. Just bring me the check," Walter said quietly. "I think I'll head home early tonight." Murphy nodded reluctantly and walked back to the register, his mind racing. He'd gotten Walter's phone number years ago, after the old man had left his wallet behind. One evening. But there was another number Murphy had written down, one Walter had given him for emergencies. His grandson's number. The bikers were getting louder and more aggressive with each round of drinks. They were the kind of customers Murphy dreaded. The ones who saw his quiet neighborhood bar as a place to cause trouble without consequences. They'd already knocked over a chair, spilled beer on the floor, and now they'd assaulted an elderly customer. Murphy knew it was only going to get worse. Walter pulled out his old flip phone to check the time. It was almost 8 o'clock, which meant his grandson would be expecting his usual evening call. The young man worried too much, always checking in to make sure his grandfather was safe and taking care of himself. Walter usually found it endearing, but tonight he wasn't sure he could keep the frustration out of his voice. He decided to wait until he got home to make the call. No point in worrying the boy over something that was already over and done with. Walter had survived the Korean War, 3 heart attacks, and burying the love of his life. He could certainly survive a few loud-mouthed bullies, but as Walter sat there trying to compose himself, his phone started ringing. The old Nokia's simple ringtone cut through the noise of the bar like a knife. Walter looked at the display and saw his grandson's name. The young man was right on schedule, as always. Walter let it ring 4 times before answering, hoping his voice would sound normal. "Hello there, son." "Hey, Grandpa," came the familiar voice from the other end. "How was your day? You sound a little tired." Walter glanced toward the table of bikers who were now arm wrestling and shouting encouragement at each other. "Oh, just the usual." "Had dinner at Murphy's, you know how it is? That's good. I worry about you eating alone all the time. I wish I could be there to have dinner with you more often." The genuine concern in his grandson's voice made Walter's throat tighten with emotion. This young man had always been special, even as a little boy. While other kids were playing video games or getting into trouble, he was asking his grandfather about his time in the army, about the medals in the bedroom drawer, about what it meant to serve your country. "I know you're busy with your training," Walter said. "Don't worry about your old grandfather. I'm tougher than I look." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Walter's grandson had inherited his grandfather's ability to read between the lines, to hear what wasn't being said. "Grandpa, are you sure you're okay?" "You really do sound different tonight," Walter almost broke then. Almost told him about the trip, the shove, the laughter that still echoed in his ears. But what good would it do? His grandson was hundreds of miles away, focused on his military career. No point in worrying him over something he couldn't fix. "I'm fine, son. Just getting old, that's all." But even as Walter said the words, one of the bikers knocked over his beer bottle, sending amber liquid cascading across their table. The crash of glass hitting the floor made Walter jump, and his grandson heard it through the phone. "What was that, Grandpa? What's going on there?" "Nothing, just some folks having a good time," Walter said, but his voice betrayed his unease. The phone call continued for a few more minutes, with Walter's grandson asking careful questions and Walter giving vague answers. Finally, they said their goodbyes with promises to talk again tomorrow. Walter closed the phone and sat back in his chair, feeling more alone than he had in years. What Walter didn't know was that his grandson hadn't hung up immediately. The young staff sergeant had heard something in his grandfather's voice that set off every alarm bell in his head. He'd been trained to read situations, to sense danger, to know when someone was in trouble even when they wouldn't admit it. 20 minutes passed. Walter finished his beer and waited for Murphy to bring his leftovers in a takeout container. The bikers were getting drunker and louder, their language getting fouler by the minute. Other customers had started leaving, not wanting to be around. When things inevitably got worse, Walter's phone rang again. This time, it wasn't his grandson, it was Murphy's landline number, the bar's main phone. Walter watched as Murphy answered it behind the bar, his face growing serious as he listened to whoever was on the other end. Murphy glanced toward Walter, then walked quickly to the back office. Walter could see him through the open door, pacing back and forth as he talked in hushed, urgent tones. The conversation lasted several minutes, with Murphy nodding and occasionally saying, "Yes, sir," and "I understand." When Murphy came back out, he looked shaken. He avoided Walter's eyes as he brought over the takeout container and the check. "Walter," he said quietly, "that was your grandson on the phone. He wanted to know exactly what happened here tonight." Walter felt his stomach drop. "What did you tell him?" Murphy's voice was barely above a whisper. "I told him the truth. About the trip, about the push, about everything. I'm sorry, Walter, but he kept asking questions, and I could tell he already knew. Something was wrong." Walter closed his eyes and rubbed his forehead. His grandson was in the military, trained for action, programmed to protect and defend. This was exactly the kind of situation that would set him off. What did he say? Murphy looked nervous, almost scared. He asked me for the exact location of the bar, how many men were involved, and whether you were still here. Then he said something about making some phone calls and that I should keep you safe until... Murphy's voice trailed off. "Until what?" "Until help arrives." "Walter, I don't think your grandson is just any regular soldier. The way he talked, the questions he asked, the authority in his voice, This feels like something big is about to happen. Walter felt a mix of pride and worry wash over him. Pride because his grandson cared enough to take action, worry because he knew what kind of man his grandson had become. The boy didn't make empty threats, and he didn't back down from fights. If he said help was coming, then help was definitely coming. The bikers were still celebrating their earlier victory, completely unaware that their actions had set something in motion that they couldn't stop. They had no idea that pushing around an old man in a small-town bar was about to become the biggest mistake of their lives. In their world, might made right, and they figured they were the biggest, toughest guys around. They were about to learn how wrong they were. 28 minutes had passed since Murphy made that phone call. Walter sat in his corner, nursing his second beer and trying to make sense of what his grandson might be planning. The old veteran had seen enough military operations to know that when soldiers started asking specific questions about locations and numbers, something serious was about to happen. The bikers had settled into their rhythm of drinking and storytelling, their voices carrying across the small bar like they owned the place. They'd completely forgotten about the old man in the corner, which was exactly how Walter preferred it. He'd been checking his watch every few minutes. Though he wasn't sure what he was waiting for, Murphy kept glancing between Walter and the front door, his nervous energy obvious to anyone paying attention. He'd been wiping the same glass for 10 minutes, and his hands were shaking slightly. Whatever Walter's grandson had told him during that phone call had clearly left a lasting impression. The thin biker called. Tommy was in the middle of telling a story about some bar fight he'd been in last month when the first sound reached them. It was distant at first, just a low rumble that could have been mistaken for thunder, but Walter recognized it immediately. His pulse quickened as the sound grew steadily louder. "You hear that?" asked one of the bikers, pausing mid-sentence. The others stopped talking and listened. The rumble was definitely getting closer, and it wasn't thunder. It was mechanical, rhythmic, and powerful. Very powerful. Walter's military training kicked in automatically. He identified the sound before anyone else in the bar had even figured out what direction it was coming from. Rotor blades. Multiple sets of them. Heavy aircraft, probably military, and they were heading straight for Murphy's bar. The sound grew louder and more distinct. Windows started vibrating in their frames. Glasses on the bar began to rattle against each other. The neon beer signs swayed slightly on their chains. Whatever was coming, it was big, and it was almost here. Tommy stood up from his chair, his face suddenly pale. "What the hell is that?" The big man with tattoos walked to the front window and peered out into the darkness. The sound was now overwhelming, filling the entire bar with its thunderous presence. Car alarms started going off in the parking lot. The building itself seemed to shake. "I don't see anything," the big man shouted over the noise. "But it sounds like it's right on top of us." Then the lights appeared. Brilliant white searchlights cut through the night sky, sweeping back and forth across the parking lot like giant fingers searching for something specific. The beams were so bright they turned night into day, illuminating every corner of the area around Murphy's bar. Walter smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. He recognized military-grade lighting when he saw it. His grandson hadn't just made a few phone calls. He'd called in the cavalry. The bikers rushed to the windows, pressing their faces against the glass to try to see what was happening outside. Their earlier bravado was rapidly evaporating, replaced by confusion and growing fear. These weren't men who were used to being on the receiving end of overwhelming force. "There!" shouted one of them, pointing up at the sky. "I can see it!" The aircraft became visible as it circled the bar, and Walter felt a surge of pride mixed with amazement. It was a Black Hawk helicopter, the kind used by elite military units for serious operations. The machine was massive, its rotors creating a downdraft so powerful that it was bending trees and sending debris flying across the parking lot. Murphy had stopped pretending to clean glasses and was staring out the window with his mouth open. The few remaining customers were frozen in place, trying to process what they were witnessing. This wasn't the kind of thing that happened in their quiet little town, ever. The helicopter made one more circle, then began to descend toward the Parking lot. The sound was deafening now, like standing next to a freight train that was somehow flying through the air. The building shook so hard that a few pictures fell off the walls. "This can't be happening," Tommy said, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engines. "Why would the military be here?" "We didn't do anything illegal," Walter almost laughed at that. Assault might not seem like a big deal to these men, but it was still a crime. More importantly, they'd made the mistake of targeting someone whose family included people with the training and resources to respond appropriately. The Black Hawk touched down in the parking lot with surprising gentleness, considering its size. The pilot was clearly experienced, setting the massive machine down between the parked cars without hitting anything. The rotors continued spinning, but at a lower speed, ready for immediate takeoff if necessary. For a moment, everything was still. The helicopter sat in the parking lot like a sleeping giant, its engines idling with barely contained power. The bikers stood frozen at the windows, unable to believe what they were seeing. Even Walter held his breath, wondering what would happen next. Then the side door of the Black Hawk slid open. 6 figures emerged from the aircraft, and Walter's heart swelled with pride and amazement. They were soldiers, but not just any soldiers. These were special operations troops, the kind of men who got called when regular forces weren't enough. They wore full combat gear, moved with perfect coordination, and carried themselves with the quiet confidence that came from extensive training and real-world experience. The first soldier out was clearly the leader. He was tall, athletic, and moved with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent years perfecting his craft. Even from inside the bar, Walter could see the resemblance. The way he held his head, the determined set of his shoulders. The careful way he surveyed the area before taking another step. It was his grandson. The other 5 soldiers spread out in a tactical formation, each one covering a different angle of approach to the bar. They weren't taking any chances, treating this like a real operation rather than a simple family matter. Walter realized that his grandson had probably told his unit exactly what had happened, and they'd responded as if one of their own brothers had been attacked. In a way, that's exactly what had happened. Walter was family to one of them, which made him family to all of them. The military brotherhood didn't end when you left the base. It extended to parents, spouses, children, and grandparents. Attacking Walter was the same as attacking any of them. The soldiers moved toward the bar entrance with practiced efficiency. They weren't rushing, but they weren't wasting time either. Each step was deliberate, calculated, designed to maximize their tactical advantage. The bikers inside could only watch in growing horror as 6 of America's most elite warriors approached their location. "We need to get out of here," whispered one of the bikers. Now, but it was too late for that. The soldiers had positioned themselves around the building, cutting off all escape routes. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The bikers were trapped, and they were starting to realize that their evening of bullying an old man was about to have consequences they'd never imagined. Tommy backed away from the window, his face white as a sheet. "This is insane." "All we did was push some old guy around." Why would the military get involved? The big man with tattoos was trying to maintain his composure, but Walter could see the fear in his eyes. "Stay calm," he told his friends. "They can't do anything to us. We're American citizens. We have rights." Walter almost felt sorry for them. They had no idea what they were dealing with. His grandson wasn't just any soldier. He was part of an elite unit trained for the most dangerous missions in the world. When men like that decided to take action, rights and regulations became secondary concerns. The front door of Murphy's bar opened, and Walter's grandson stepped inside. He was still wearing full combat gear, his face hidden behind tactical goggles and protective equipment, but Walter would have recognized him anywhere. This was the little boy who used to sit on his lap and listen to war stories, all grown up, and ready to write his own. Behind him came the other 5 soldiers, spreading out inside the bar with the same tactical precision they'd shown outside. Within seconds, they had the entire room under control. Every exit covered, every potential threat assessed and neutralized. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the jukebox seemed to have stopped playing, as if the music itself was afraid. to make a sound. The bikers stood frozen, suddenly understanding that they were no longer the most dangerous people in the room. Not even close. The silence in Murphy's bar was so thick you could cut it with a knife. 6 elite soldiers stood in tactical formation, their presence transforming the small neighborhood bar into something that felt more like a war zone. The bikers, who had been so loud and aggressive just minutes before, now looked like scared children facing their worst nightmare. Walter's grandson removed his tactical goggles slowly, revealing eyes that burned with controlled fury. He was a young man in his late 20s, but his face carried the hard-earned authority of someone who'd seen real combat and commanded respect in the most dangerous places on earth. When he spoke, his voice was calm, measured, and absolutely terrifying in its restraint. "Everyone stay exactly where you are," he said, though it wasn't really necessary. Nobody in that bar was moving a muscle. His eyes swept the room, taking in every detail, assessing every person present. When his gaze finally settled on Walter, sitting quietly in his corner, his expression softened just slightly. Not enough for the bikers to notice, but Walter saw it. The look of a grandson who loved his grandfather and was barely keeping his anger in check. The young staff sergeant walked slowly across the bar, his boots making deliberate contact with the wooden floor. Each step echoed in the silence like a countdown to Judgment Day. The other soldiers maintained their positions, creating an invisible barrier between the bikers and any possible escape route. Walter started to stand up, but his grandson gestured for him to stay seated. Instead, the young soldier knelt down beside his grandfather's chair, speaking in a voice so quiet that only Walter could hear. "Are you hurt, Grandpa?" Walter shook his head. "I'm fine, son. Just a bruised shoulder and some hurt pride." "Tell me exactly what happened." Walter glanced toward the bikers, who were straining to hear the conversation. "It's not important now. You shouldn't have come all this way for something so small." The grandson's jaw tightened. "It's not small to me. Tell me what happened." So, Walter did. In quiet, simple words, he explained about the trip, the fall, the shove that sent him sprawling across the floor. He told his grandson about the laughter, the humiliation, the way these men had treated him like he was worthless simply because he was old Dot. As Walter spoke, his grandson's face grew harder and harder. By the time the story was finished, the young soldier looked like he was carved from stone. He stood up slowly, turned around, and faced the group of bikers who had caused all this trouble. "Which one of you put your hands on my grandfather?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. The bikers shuffled their feet and avoided eye contact, suddenly finding the floor very interesting. None of them wanted to answer that question. "I asked you a question," the staff sergeant repeated, his voice carrying the kind of authority that demanded immediate response. "Which one of you assaulted an 84-year-old man?" The big man with tattoos finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak than his usual boom. "Look, soldier boy, we don't want any trouble. We were just having some fun. The old man tripped, that's all." Walter's grandson took a step closer to the big man, and suddenly the biker didn't look so big anymore. "Fun? You call assaulting a senior citizen fun?" "Nobody assaulted nobody," Tommy chimed in, trying to sound braver than he felt. "He fell down, we laughed. Big deal. Old people fall down all the time." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. Walter's grandson turned his attention to Tommy, studying him like a scientist, examining an interesting specimen. "You think it's funny when elderly people get hurt?" "I didn't say that, because that's what I heard." "You said old people fall down all the time, and you think it's a big joke." The young soldier's voice was getting quieter, which somehow made it more frightening. "Let me tell you something about that old man over there." He gestured toward Walter, and every eye in the bar followed his hand. That man served in the Korean War when he was 19 years old. He earned a Purple Heart when Chinese shrapnel tore through his leg. He earned a Bronze Star for pulling 3 wounded soldiers to safety under enemy fire. He came home and worked 40 years in a factory to support his family. He raised 2 children who both became teachers. He was married to the same woman for 52 years until cancer took her away. The bikers were listening now, really listening, and some of them were starting to look uncomfortable. This wasn't the story they'd expected to hear about the quiet old man they'd pushed around. He pays his taxes, votes in every election, volunteers at the food bank every Saturday, and calls his grandchildren every night to make sure they're safe and happy. He's everything that's good about this country, everything that people like me fight to protect. Walter felt tears pricking at his eyes. He'd never heard his grandson talk about him this way, never realized how much the young man respected and admired him. "And you," the staff sergeant continued, focusing his attention back on the bikers, "thought it would be fun to push him around because he's old and can't fight back. You thought you were tough guys, picking on someone who couldn't defend himself." The silence stretched out until it became unbearable. One of the bikers, a younger man who hadn't said much during the evening, finally spoke up. "We didn't know. We weren't thinking ... No, you weren't thinking. You saw an elderly man trying to mind his own business, and you decided to make him your entertainment for the evening." Walter's grandson looked around the group, making eye contact with each of them. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Before anyone could answer, the sound of sirens filled the air outside. Multiple police cars were approaching fast, their lights flashing through the windows of the bar. Walter's grandson had obviously called for backup of the civilian variety as well. "Here's what's going to happen," the young soldier announced as the sirens grew louder. "You're going to apologize to my grandfather. A real apology, not some half-hearted mumbling. Then you're going to deal with the police, who are very interested in charging you with assault. After that, you're going to leave this town and never come back." The front door opened and 3 police officers entered. The lead officer, a middle-aged man with sergeant's stripes, took one look around the room and immediately understood the situation. The military had called this in, which meant it was serious business. "Officers," Walter's grandson said, his tone respectful but businesslike, "these men assaulted my grandfather, an 84-year-old veteran. We have witnesses, and I'm sure the security camera captured everything." Murphy nodded vigorously from behind the bar. "I saw the whole thing, officer. They tripped him on purpose, then pushed him down when he asked why they did it." The police sergeant looked at the bikers with obvious disgust. "Assaulting an elderly person is a felony in this state. You gentlemen are in serious trouble." But Walter's grandson wasn't finished. He walked back to his grandfather and helped the old man to his feet. "Stand up, Grandpa. I want everyone in this room to see who you really are." Walter stood slowly, his grandson's strong hand supporting his elbow. Despite everything that had happened, he still carried himself with dignity and pride. "Look at him," the young soldier said to the bikers. "Really look at him. This man fought for your freedom before you were born. He worked hard, played by the rules, and tried to make the world a better place. He deserves your respect, not your cruelty." The big man with tattoos was the first to break. Maybe it was the presence of the police, or maybe it was finally understanding what he'd really done. "I'm sorry," he said to Walter, and for the first time all evening he sounded like he meant it. "I'm really sorry. We were drunk and stupid, and there's no excuse for what we did." One by one, the other bikers followed suit. Tommy was crying by the time he managed to get his apology out. The younger one who'd spoken up earlier looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Walter listened to each apology with grace and dignity. When they were finished, he nodded slowly. "I accept your apologies," he said quietly. "But I hope you've learned something tonight about treating people with respect." The police took statements and made arrests, though the charges would likely be reduced if the bikers agreed to community service and anger management classes. Walter's grandson made sure they understood that any repeat of this behavior would result in much more serious consequences. As the excitement died down and the bar returned to something approaching normal, Walter found himself surrounded by neighbors and strangers who had heard about what happened. Word traveled fast in a small town, and people wanted to thank him for his service and make sure he was all right. The young soldier had to return to base, but not before spending an hour talking with his grandfather about everything and nothing. As he prepared to leave, he hugged Walter tightly. "I'm proud to be your grandson," he said. "I'm proud to be your grandfather," Walter replied. Murphy refused to let Walter pay for his meal that night, or any night for the next month. The story spread throughout the community, and Walter found himself something of a local celebrity. But more importantly, he'd learned that he wasn't as alone as he'd thought. His family would always have his back, and his community would always support him. Some lessons, he reflected, are worth learning at any age.